Hey guys, this episode has been cleared for public release, but just barely. Price is fair and reasonable. That line shows up everywhere, and most of the time, it sounds just fine. It sounds like the file is under control. But sometimes it's not the result of analysis. It is simply a justification. And there is a difference, a big one, because price analysis is supposed to ask a question. Justification usually starts with the answer. And if your analysis starts with an answer, it is the procurement version of drawing the target around the arrow after it's already hit the wall. And now with more pressure towards firm fixed price and performance-based contracting, this matters even more. Because under fixed price, bad pricing logic does not just create a weak file. It can create a bad deal, and it can turn uncertainty into a promise. And if you price ambiguity like certainty, don't be shocked when performance sends you the bill. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when price analysis stops being a real evaluation and turns into a very well-written defense of a decision somebody else made earlier. Because fair and reasonable is not a magic phrase. It is not seasoning. You cannot sprinkle it on a weak file and suddenly make the price defensible. That is not a price analysis. That is no more than price justification, wearing a nice, pretty tie.
This broadcast has been cleared for public release, but just barely.
Broadcasting from deep inside the Federal Acquisition Labyrinth, this is the GovCon Show. This show is for acquisition pros, wannabe pros, and procurement insiders who need a place to unpack the chaos. We speak fluent contracting and sarcasm. No clearance required. This is the GovCon Show. And away we go!
Welcome back to the GovCon Show, broadcasting from deep inside the Federal Acquisition Labyrinth, where the spreadsheets are polished, the narratives are creative, and the conclusion was apparently decided 3 meetings ago. This is the show where contracting professionals say the quiet part out loud. Just real conversations from the front lines of government contracting. You know, one of the fastest ways to see whether your system actually works is to look at how your company supports price reasonableness. Not how it labels the form, not whether somebody typed fair and reasonable in the right box. I mean whether or not the file actually shows why the price makes sense. Let's start with the simplest version of this. Real price analysis answers one basic question. Compared to what? That's it. That's the whole game. Compared to what? Other quotes? Maybe historical prices. Maybe even market research. You might have a true independent estimate even. But surely you have compared the price to something that gives you the conclusion or a reason to exist. Because if the file says the price is fair and reasonable, the next question should be obvious. Based on what? Well, if the answer is, well, it seemed reasonable at the time, no. If the answer is, well, we've used them before, maybe you're walking towards something useful here, but you're not there yet. And if your answer is, well, the program needed it quickly, congratulations. You've just described pressure, but not price analysis. Real price analysis does not explain the price. It tests the price. It shows why the price makes sense using something more than confidence and a deadline, because confidence is not control and a deadline is not evidence. Here's the bottom line. If there's no real comparison, then there's no analysis. There's just a conclusion with pretty formatting. And honestly, I truly believe, that most contractors believe they are doing true price analysis. And I understand why. They have a form, they have a sentence that says, based on the information I've reviewed, the price is determined to be fair and reasonable. Very official, beautiful. Possibly even use the Times New Roman font, which always make bad logic feel so federal. But here's the problem. Explaining a price is not the same as analyzing a price. People tend to think that if the file contains enough words, then it must contain analysis. No, words are not analysis. A paragraph is not an analysis. A conclusion is not an analysis. A nice sentence that says the price is fair and reasonable does not make it an analysis. Price analysis requires a basis. It requires some way to show that the price makes sense in relation to something else. Otherwise, what do you really have? You have a statement. You have an opinion. You have a procurement bedtime story. And bedtime stories are lovely, but they do not hold up well when somebody starts asking, compared to what? Now, we all know what really and truly happens, and that is exactly why we're going to talk about it anyway. Here is what happens most of the time. The supplier's already been selected. The program already wants to move forward. The subcontractor is waiting. The customer's asking for status, and somebody says, just get the subcontract file done. That's the moment that speed starts replacing scrutiny. The file stops being evaluated and starts defending. Now the file is no longer asking, does the price make sense? The file's asking, how do we make this decision look reasonable? That's where price analysis becomes price justification. Not because people are bad, not because they woke up and said, you know what, this procurement file needs a little creative writing. Usually it happens because the business is under pressure, and pressure is not rare. Pressure has its own parking space, but pressure does not change the standard. Now let's talk about why it matters. Even more in the current environment, it matters because this is just not about procurement file cleanliness anymore. This is about pricing risk now. When fixed price and performance-based contracting become more prominent, the quality of pricing logic matters so much more. A weak price analysis in a cost-type environment may create a file problem, but a weak file pricing assumption under a fixed price contract can become a major business problem. Under fixed price, the contractor is not just proving that a supplier's price looked reasonable at the time. He may be building the foundation for a total contract price that has to survive the full contract period of performance. That means the analysis cannot be lazy. It cannot just say, this looks reasonable. The analysis has to be solid and reliable, which means it needs to ask much harder questions. What assumptions are built into that price? Are travel and ODCs included? Are escalation risk really addressed? Are labor assumptions realistic? Are your subcontractor prices aligned with the prime contract and what the prime contractor is promising to do for the government? Because under fixed price, a weak comparison does not just wobble in the file. It can wobble all the way to your profit line. And a profit wobble is not a recommended business practice. So my recommendation is that if you are playing in the firm fixed price world, be absolutely sure that you do not price ambiguity like you would certainty. That means taking unclear scope, unstable requirements, volatile material cost, subjective acceptance criteria, and treating all of it like the price is built on solid ground. It's not. This is not pricing. That is optimism with formulas. Now, if the requirement is unclear, then pricing should say so. If the assumption was fragile, then pricing should say so. The analysis should not hide the uncertainty. It should expose it, because uncertainty that is visible can be negotiated or protected, excluded or managed. But uncertainty that is hidden becomes a huge surprise. And fixed price surprises are rarely adorable. They usually arrive as a cost growth, subcontract disputes, or leadership asking why the profit percentage disappeared like it went to witness protection. That's why price analysis matters. It is not just a file exercise. It's a risk discipline. Let's flip the lens here, because reviewers do not read the file the way you wrote it. You wrote it with context. They read it cold. You know the urgency, but they don't. You know the program pressure, but they're not emotionally invested in your internal chaos. They're looking at one thing: what is fair and reasonable, and what's that determination based on? Not, does this sound reasonable? All they want to know is, what is the determination based on? And if that answer requires an explanation, an opinion, or a sentence that says fair and reasonable, but doesn't show a comparison, that's not evidence. That's a problem waiting for better lighting. Because the auditors and reviewers are not there to fill in the blanks for you. They're not there to say, well, I'm sure this was good at one point. I'm sure there was a good reason for it. If the file doesn't show the logic, then the logic might as well not exist. And I get it. That sounds harsh. Well, guess what? Welcome to government contracting. We have clauses. Now, we all know that this does not normally happen once. It happens across files, across buyers, multiple programs. One file has a strong comparison. Another file has only a paragraph. One buyer uses historic pricing. Another file uses a supplier quote and a good dose of optimism. One file explains all the adjustments they made, and another one just says price appears reasonable. Based on what? A weather pattern? The faint smell of competition, maybe? But my point is that once that variation shows up across multiple files, now you're no longer looking at 1 week analysis. You're looking at a system pattern. And that's a much bigger issue, because a bad price analysis in one file is just a file problem. But inconsistent price analysis across files is truly a system problem. And system problems don't get fixed with one cleaner paragraph. They get fixed by changes to the system, changing how decisions are made, reviewed, supported, and documented. And that matters even more under fixed price, because if one team prices risk carefully and another team prices hope aggressively, the company is not operating from a consistent pricing discipline. It's gambling. It's gambling differently across the building. That's not a strategy. That's roulette with a subcontract folder. I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, we have internal reviews and they'll catch this type of issue. Well, my experience tells me that most of the time, internal reviews miss this stuff, because internally, it all makes sense. You know why the supplier was chosen. You know why those constraints were in place and what they were. You know the program needed the work to keep moving. But the file doesn't know that. The file doesn't know the program manager had 3 meetings with the customer. The file doesn't know that the supplier had performed well before on 2 other contracts, or that the market was tight. The file doesn't know that the schedule was collapsing. The file only knows what you put in it. And if what you put in it is a clean, well-sounding explanation instead of actual analysis, that's what the reviewer sees. They don't see your context, they see your conclusion. And if your conclusion is not tied to evidence, it starts to wobble. That's the technical term, procurement wobble. Very common. Hey, it's not recommended. So let's talk about now what good should look like. Well, it's not perfect. Perfect is not the standard. And if your compliance plan requires perfection, stop. Please just stop. That's not a plan. That's a nervous breakdown with the template. But a good price analysis should show the basis of comparison. It should identify the data source and explain the adjustments. It should answer the questions, compared to what? Why the comparison was deemed reasonable? What other alternatives you considered? And which ones did you reject? And under fixed price pressure, it should also show whether or not the pricing logic is strong enough to support the risk that you're accepting. And no, that doesn't mean that every file needs a dissertation. Nobody's asking for a 40-page love letter to price reasonableness, but the file does need to show enough logic for someone who was not there to understand how you got the conclusion. Because if the file requires you to stand next to it and explain what happened, then the file is not doing its job. All right, guys, if this episode is hit close to home, then you understand exactly why we built the fixed price conversion risk assessment. Because fixed price conversion is not just about contract type, it's all about the risk. And pricing is one of the first places that risk either gets understood or buried. And our assessment helps contractors like you look at the things that really matter before they accept that fixed price risk. Because before you agree to a fixed price, you need to know whether your price is built on evidence or optimism. So just go to our website at govconadvisorygroup.com and look for the fixed price conversion risk assessment. Before you accept the risk, understand the risk. And if your concern is broader purchasing system consistency, then the CPSR readiness diagnostic is there too. But for companies facing fixed price pressure right now, start with the question that matters the most. Are we pricing the risk? Or are we just justifying the price? So let's bring this one home. Price analysis is not about writing something that sounds right. It's about showing something that holds up. It asks, compared to what, based on what, supported by what evidence. And now, in a market pushing harder towards fixed price and performance-based outcomes, the question gets even sharper. Can this price survive the risk that we are accepting? Because explanation is not protection, and fair and reasonable is not just a spell. If your analysis starts with the answer, it may not be an analysis. It may be no more than a justification. And if you're moving into fixed price work, price justification is not just weak documentation. It is a warning sign, flashing lights. So look at your files, look at your pricing, look at your assumptions, and ask the question your file should already be able to answer. Compared to what? And then ask the question your business needs answering before you accept a fixed price. Can we live with this price if our assumptions are wrong? And if you're not sure, don't guess. Go back and run that fixed price conversion risk assessment on our website, because by the time you're defending the price, you are no longer analyzing. You are explaining why the decision already happened. And that's a different conversation. More people, more meetings, and probably at least one spreadsheet named Price Analysis Corrective Action Tracker. Final. Nobody needs that kind of energy. Guys, that wraps this episode up. And if this has hit a little close to home, good. That probably means it was useful. We encourage you to like it and share it with somebody in government contracting who thinks fair and reasonable is a complete sentence. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All right, guys, this is the GovCon Show. And yeah, this one was cleared for public release, but just barely.
If today's episode sounded a little too familiar, that's probably a sign. Until next time, keep your files tight, your logic tighter. Remember, if your compliance approach is built on checking boxes, you're building risk. We'll see you next time on the GovCon Show.
This broadcast has been cleared for public release, but just barely.